Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're diving into an unsolved Canadian case. Kelly Cook was a 15-year-old who liked to make extra money on the weekends and during her free time as a babysitter for the people in her tiny, tiny town. Kelly accepted one babysitting gig from a man that she'd never met, and after she was picked up, she was never seen again. This case is probably going to piss you off and make you want to throw things and break things, so just bear with me. I also wanted to throw out a little reminder for Patreon members that your bi-weekly bite-sized episode will be out this Friday on June 7th, 2024. So be on the lookout for that. And if you want extra episodes or more content and more cases, then you can head over to Patreon and just search Mama Murdered a Podcast, or you can use the link in the description box, and that link will be under each and every episode where you can sign up. Now, with all the business out of the way and without further ado, let's get it. Kelly Cook was born in Canada on June 15th, 1965, to her parents Walter and Marion Cook, so this is a Canadian case, and it's sadly still an unsolved case. Now, Kelly also had two siblings, one sister and one brother, and the family all ended up moving to a teeny tiny town called Standard sometime in 1979, and that's if my math is right. So, Standard is actually so small that it's not even really considered a town, but instead it's referred to as a village. I will be referring to it as a town just because I feel like that's easier, but just know that I am aware it's a village. And to give a little bit of reference about how small the town of Standard actually is, in 2011, the population was only 379. And then in 2016, the population of the town of Standard was still only 353. So, less than 400 people living in this tiny village between the years of 2011 and 2016. Now, Kelly's case actually takes place in 1981, so that should tell you how small the population likely was in 1991 when this case was breaking. And it seems to me like the tiny town of Standard is more like a farming community and really only a place that most people would be passing through on their way to maybe a bigger city or town. Standard was a place where, obviously, everyone knew everyone, and going to the grocery store or the gas station was literally considered like an outing for the day. Kelly was a good student, she was super smart, and she was wise beyond her years. And at just 15 years old, Kelly was holding full-blown conversations about, like, politics and even other serious topics. Kelly was super well liked by her classmates. She was always really driven and ambitious, and she had plans on becoming a lawyer. So Kelly knew exactly what goals she wanted to reach, and she also knew the time and effort that she would have to put into making those dreams become an achievement. So she knew it wasn't going to be easy, but she also knew what she wanted to do with her life, and she was going to do whatever it took to get her there. And even at the young age of just 15, Kelly was a trusted and reliable babysitter for a lot of the parents in her small community. Kelly was a lot of people's go-to babysitter. Parents trusted Kelly with their kids, and Kelly was always really good with kids. So it wasn't out of the usual for someone to call Kelly last minute and just ask if she'd be willing to come over and babysit for them. And like I said, the town of Standard was so small that I have to believe that everyone would probably very literally know everyone else in the town. So obviously, Kelly's own parents would have also known the adults that Kelly would have been babysitting for. This was something that Kelly did often in her free time, but she also kept pretty busy doing other things outside of school and her babysitting gig. For instance, she was on a figure skating team, and she really loved hanging out with her friends and spending time with them. So it wasn't really a shock when 15-year-old Kelly got a call at around 8:20 a.m. on the morning of Wednesday, April 22nd, in 1981. The landline phone rang while Kelly was getting ready for school, and when she answered the phone, no one responded when Kelly was like, hello, hello. So after not getting a response and not hearing anyone else on the other end of the phone, Kelly just kind of hung the phone back up and went to walk away. But as she walked away to finish getting ready for school, the phone rang again. This time when Kelly answered, however, there was a man on the other end of the line. This man told Kelly that his name was Bill Christensen, and he asked Kelly if she would be able to babysit for him later on that evening. Now, Kelly didn't know a man by the name of Bill Christensen, And with as small as the town of Standard was, it was weird that Kelly didn't know who this man was or recognize his name. The man explained that he had recently just moved to the area and that he had actually gotten Kelly's number from another girl that was on her figure skating team. This man said that he'd already called Kelly's friend that was on her figure skating team to see if she could babysit for him, but for whatever reason, the friend was busy and wasn't able to do it, so she actually passed along Kelly's name and number and information to Bill and told him that Kelly might be available to babysit for him instead since she was busy. Now, this friend that relayed Kelly's information to Bill has remained anonymous throughout this entire thing, so I'm just going to give her the initial of J, and we'll just use that in place of her name. So, Bill had called Jay to see if she could babysit. She told him she was busy, she wouldn't be able to, but she gave him Kelly's information instead. But Kelly was still a little hesitant, even though Kelly knew Jay, the friend that Bill had been referring to. It was just that Kelly had never heard the name Bill Christensen before. So, Bill went on to explain that he would need a sitter from 8:30 p.m. to midnight that night. And Kelly just kind of told him that she still needed to talk to her parents and make sure that it was okay with them, but that it should be fine, and she told him that he could pick her up at home that evening. So, Kelly's mom, Marion, actually instructed Kelly to go around the school to see if any of her friends or classmates knew who this Bill Christensen man was. So that's exactly what Kelly did. When she got to school, she asked around to see if anyone knew who Bill Christensen was, and if so, how did they know him, and so on and so forth. But although none of Kelly's classmates or friends knew a Bill Christensen, the last name Christensen was extremely common in the tiny town of Standard. So think of the last name like Smith, Jones, Brown. That's how common the last name Christensen was in the town of Standard. So even though Kelly or her parents had no idea who Bill Christensen was, they almost just kind of assumed that maybe he was a friend of a friend or an extended relative to someone that they did know. And with a town as small as this, no one would have ever imagined that someone walking around in their community could be dangerous. But Kelly had already agreed to take this babysitting gig, and this wasn't a time where you could just do a quick Google search and check somebody's references or check and see if they were a creep or not. And again, Kelly's parents just assumed that Bill was an extended relative of someone that they knew or someone that they knew through a friend of a friend. So this babysitting gig was set. Bill was going to pick Kelly up from her house at 8:30 p.m. and then he would take Kelly and drop her off at his house where she would babysit his kids. And then the plan was that Bill would just drop Kelly off home once him and his wife returned from their date night or, whatever. So when 8:30 p.m. rolled around that evening, a 4-door car pulled into Kelly's family's home driveway. And Kelly just kind of yelled in to let her parents know that Bill was here, and she got in the car. Now, my question here is, why wouldn't this man, who the family has never met, just pull into the driveway without getting out to introduce himself to Kelly's parents? I don't know, I guess maybe this is just one of those things where, it was a different time and people weren't as weary of strangers, and before we all lost all hope in humanity. So, Bill had pulled into the Cook family driveway, driving a 4-door car that was light in color. Bill never got out of the car to introduce himself, and Kelly's parents didn't walk out to meet this man either. Now, Kelly always made sure to call her parents to let them know when she made it to the house that she was supposed to be babysitting at. This was just kind of an unspoken rule. Kelly had always made sure to call her parents to let them know once she'd made it to the house that she would be babysitting at. But on this night, that call never came, and Kelly was never seen alive again after climbing into the car with the man that was supposedly named Bill. And it didn't matter if Kelly had babysit for the same family 30 times, she always made sure to call home to let her parents know that she'd made it to the house where she was going to be babysitting. So when a few hours passed and Kelly still hadn't called home to let her parents know that she'd made it to Bill's house safely, Kelly's parents knew something was wrong. But then when midnight rolled around and Kelly never returned home like she planned, Kelly's parents wasted no time in calling police to report their 15-year-old daughter missing. And you'll probably be surprised to learn that the police actually took Kelly's disappearance seriously from the jump. They never tried to claim that she was a runaway. They never tried to claim that she was just off with a boy. It seems like they knew that this entire situation just seemed off. But with the phone call where no one spoke, and then immediately after that, a man Bill called claiming to know Jay, who was Kelly's friend, but then no one knew this man and the name wasn't ringing a bell, police knew that this was potentially dangerous and they immediately started their search for Kelly. And from the start of this investigation, police were treating Kelly's missing persons report as an endangered missing persons case. And after she was reported missing, an overnight search was conducted. So this search would have technically been happening on Thursday, April 23rd, since Kelly was supposed to be home at midnight after babysitting until right up until midnight on the 22nd. So the early morning hours between when you would be sleeping between the 22nd turning into the 23rd, that's when this first overnight search took place. But even with all the police taking this case extremely seriously during the first search to try to find Kelly, nothing of substance was found. And later on that morning, on April 23rd, police were setting up checkpoints to search any and every vehicle that was coming and going through this area. And it's also not shocking to learn that by daybreak, word around town had spread about Kelly's disappearance and possible abduction, and there were immediately volunteers and people in the community coming out to help search. But like I said from the top of this episode, the tiny town or village of Standard was mostly farmland. So that meant a lot of acreage and woods and isolated areas that needed to be searched, and the community definitely showed up and showed out in trying to find Kelly. And naturally, the main person of interest at this point was this unknown man who claimed that his name was Bill Christensen. There were search dogs brought out, grid searches conducted, teams of different volunteers, helicopters flying overhead, everything. Every resource was used, and every able body was willing to help. And these searches still turned up absolutely nothing. Police and volunteers were searching farmlands, ditches, buildings, woods, just anywhere. And before Kelly had even been missing for a whole 48 hours, there had been more than 350 officers from other areas come out to help search, and in between that, all the volunteers that had shown up, they had been able to search more than a 1,250 square mile area, which is incredible, especially for the size of this town. But after police started questioning residents of this tiny village of Standard, they were surprised to learn that no one knew a man by the name of Bill Christensen, which to me, this just makes me think that this man did his homework. Like if he wasn't actually from the town of Standard, then he had to have taken the time to learn that the last name Christensen was super common in this area, and if he was from this area, then I feel like he had to have made this Bill Christensen name up, or else someone would have known who he was. But my thing with that is that he really couldn't have been a local to the town of Standard, and I say that because the town that I live in is pretty small. It's like less than 2,000 people. This town had 400 people, and I can point out who is at our grocery store just by riding by and seeing whose cars are parked in the parking lot. Like, I don't actually have to go in and see their faces or see them driving and pulling into the grocery store to know who's in the grocery store when I ride by. I can just see someone's car from the road, and I automatically know who's in that grocery store and whose car that belongs to. That happens at grocery stores, the post office, the gas station, the fast food restaurants. You can do this in this town of about 2,000 people. Standard had less than 400 people. So it would have to be like 10 times worse in Standard. And yet nobody recognized this 4-door light-colored car, which makes me think that it's somebody who doesn't actually live in the Standard area. Which, then that thought just brings me back to thinking that this has to be someone who did their homework, or else how would they know that the last name Christensen was so common? And something else that may explain this is maybe this man didn't live in Standard, but maybe he had family in Standard, or maybe he worked a job where he traveled through the town of Standard pretty frequently. I don't know, but let's keep going. So police are talking to everyone in this, little tiny town of Standard, and they learn that no one knows a Bill Christensen. It just seems like he doesn't exist. And this led police to believe that it's pretty likely that this man's name wasn't actually Bill Christensen, surprise, surprise. But real name or not, police were taking any and all tips and leads seriously. and they were following through with all of them, no matter how outlandish they seemed. Because, of course, there were people who called and said they had a vision of Kelly in a ditch or in a body of water, and there were a few tips that came in that actually did really spark police's interest. One tip was called in by a 911 operator, and this call came in on April 22nd, which was the same night that Kelly was picked up by the man who called himself Bill. This call came in to 911 at around 10:30 p.m., which would have also been the right time frame of when Kelly was supposed to have been at Bill's house babysitting. Because remember, this babysitting gig was supposed to be from 8:30 to midnight. But this 911 call is coming in at 10:30. So this 911 dispatcher says that the call was traced to a payphone in a town called Husser. And the town of Husser is only about a 20-minute drive away from the little tiny town of Standard where Kelly was taken from. The 911 operator also says that when she answered the call, that all she could hear was what sounded like a girl screaming. These were like frantic and hysterical screams, and they were actually so loud that the 911 operator had to pull her headset off. After this, the call was disconnected by the end of the phone that was coming from the town of Husser. So it was disconnected from the end of the line of whoever called 911 to start with. And it's pretty widely speculated that the girl who was on this 911 call that came from this payphone probably was Kelly. And although that's a pretty reasonable thought, it's never been proven that the girl on that call that was screaming was Kelly. Now, there was another tip that came in, and this tip was from a cashier at a gas station. This tip was letting police know that on April 22nd, which again was the night that Bill picked Kelly up for this babysitting gig, but that on April 22nd, that a man had come into the gas station and asked the cashier to use the phone inside of the gas station. This man claimed that the payphone outside was broken, that it wasn't working, and since the payphone wasn't working, the cashier did agree to let this man come behind the counter of the store to use the store's phone. But since this man had to come behind the counter of the store to use the phone, the gas station cashier was able to overhear some parts of the conversation. And the cashier was able to confirm that the conversation that this man had been having on this phone was actually about babysitting. So obviously, police believe that this was the man who picked Kelly up, claiming to be Bill Christensen. Especially since this gas station was local to the town of Standard where Kelly lived, and since this man had been heard asking the person that he just called about getting a babysitter. So police asked the cashier to describe what this man looked like, and the cashier described this mystery man as being a white man with dark hair who appeared to be a farmer of some kind. The cashier also remembered that this man's face was more round than it was long and skinny, and that he was pretty clean shaven. The cashier said that he guessed that this man was between 30 and 40 years old, and that he was possibly about 5'9" tall. He also said that he was a heavier set man. But the cashier also said that it sounded like the man was pretty familiar with whoever he was talking to on the phone about babysitting. And the cashier says that he based this off of the man's tone, posture, and confidence while he was on the phone asking about babysitting. Police weren't able to track down who made that 911 call, and they weren't able to track down the man who had asked the gas station cashier to use the phone either. But both tips did seem promising, but just nothing came afterwards. Now, the description of the caller that the cashier relayed back to police was also the same description that locals had given law enforcement about a man that had drawn some attention to everyone in town. Because since this town was so small, a new face doesn't go unnoticed. So locals let law enforcement know that they had seen a man who didn't live in the town, and that they had seen this man at the Staffmore Hotel bar. These locals gave a pretty close description to the description that was given to law enforcement by the cashier at the gas station, where it's believed that the call to Kelly's home was made. There were also claims of a man matching this same description who had been seen by locals in the local grocery store and also in the local gas station. And of course, this man stood out to everyone because he was a new face in town. No one had ever seen him in Standard before, and a new face isn't going unnoticed in a town with less than 400 people. So this man stuck out in people's minds and in their memories. But this man also stuck out in the minds of the locals because everyone that had had an actual encounter with this man all said the same thing. They all said that he was super rude and even arrogant, which would also be something that I feel like you would remember having that encounter of, especially with a new person in town. So with all of these different people who are all describing what seems to be the same man, a sketch was made in hopes that it would generate new leads, and once that sketch was released to the public, there were a slew of new tips called in to the RCMPs, or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and even though there were all of these new leads coming into police, and even though police were following up with every single lead that they got, they still weren't any closer to finding Kelly. And they still had no idea who this man that had been claiming to be Bill Christensen even was. And there really wasn't much else happening in this case after that for a few months. But then in June, there was finally a new development within Kelly's case. It was June 28th, 1981, 2 months after Kelly had been reported missing, that a group of teenagers were out exploring and biking, and they were biking and exploring around an irrigation canal. And this irrigation canal was at the Chin Lake Reservoir near Taber in Alberta, Canada, when they came across the body. There had been a drought in the area recently, which in turn had water levels pretty low near the canal. One of the boys in this group of teenagers saw what he thought was a body laying face down on the shore where the water would have normally been covering had it not been for the recent drought. There were cinder blocks tied to the body, presumably as a means to weigh it down, and the body had been bound by ropes. But because the body had been in the water for so long, the only way to confirm the identification of this body was through the use of dental records. And those dental records were able to confirm that the body found was in fact 15-year-old Kelly Cook. Kelly's body had been discovered in the town of Taber, which is about 2.5 hours away from Kelly's hometown of Standard, and her body was still fully clothed when it was discovered. Police speculate that whoever murdered Kelly, that the suspect believed that Kelly's body would never be found. Between the way that she was bound by the rope and the way that her body was weighed down with cinder blocks, that Kelly's murderer thought that her body would never be discovered. An autopsy was done, and it's widely believed that Kelly was both killed and dumped in the water on the same night that she was taken. Kelly's dad was the first one notified by police that Kelly's body had been found, and her dad went ahead and left work right then to go break the news to Kelly's mom and siblings. Her dad wanted to tell them before the media picked up on it so that they would know what was going on. So Kelly's dad didn't want them to find out through the media, and the night that Kelly had been picked up by Bill for this babysitting job, once they had reported her missing, her parents had left the porch light on, just in case Kelly was ever able to make her way back home. And when Kelly's dad walked into the house to let the rest of the family know that her body had been found, all her dad had to say was that it was time for them to cut the porch light off now, and everyone in the family immediately knew what he was saying. Which, this is just so sad. It breaks my heart. He didn't even have to say that her body had been found. Once he said we can cut the porch light off, they just knew. So, once the body was discovered, an autopsy was done, and once the autopsy was released, it was revealed that there were no signs that Kelly had been sexually assaulted, which is a good thing, but it also just makes this case all the more confusing for me. I mean, as awful as it is to say, I feel like 99.99999% of murdered teens are killed for sexual reasons, and if it's not for a sexual reason, it's to cover up sexual abuse. I just feel like it's less likely for someone to do so much research and homework on Kelly and the town that she lived in, and, in order to make this whole babysitting story up and make it sound believable enough for Kelly to even take the babysitting job, all of this to be done just for them to kill her. In my head, there would have to be a sexual motive. But then again, according to the autopsy, there were no signs of sexual abuse on Kelly's body. And I'm not sure about this part, but it does make me wonder, and I could be wrong, but it makes me wonder if the water would have possibly washed any signs of sexual abuse away. I'm not 100% sure how that would work, or if water would even be able to wash away signs of a sexual abuse. But I don't know, because the water just completely destroys most other types of evidence. So would it also destroy any evidence of a sexual assault too? I don't know, but it does make me wonder. Now, Kelly's cause of death was never listed officially, or at least from what I could find, but it is widely believed that she died of strangulation. I could have very possibly missed this bit of information on her case, like on her cause of death, in my research, because these badass kids are out of school as of today, and they have been running me ragged for the last week with school stuff and 5th grade graduations and award ceremonies and this and that and the third, and so excuse me if I missed that bit of information or if it's wrong. But even with finding Kelly's body and having an autopsy done, neither of those things gave police any more clues or leads to follow up on. And this is when the FBI was brought in to help with the investigation. The FBI also went on to create a profile for this suspect. And the FBI was called in after, Kelly's small town and the towns around there had already been investigating, the people and where she lived. At this point, there had been more than 2,000 people already interviewed, investigated, and cleared. So the profile that the FBI came up with was that Kelly's murderer was likely a man who wasn't married at the time. The FBI did think that the suspect had possibly been married once before, if not more than once. They also believed that when the suspect's marriages had come to an end, that this man most likely got super hostile, maybe even violent and aggressive, and holding a lot of animosity towards their spouses. The FBI also believed that any and or all of these marriages involving this suspect would have likely been domestic violence relationships. So whoever this guy is, if the FBI's right, he's just all around not a good guy. And as far as the sketch that police had released to the public, I'll try to remember to post it on the Mama Murdered a Podcast social media pages, but this man is nothing to write home to mama about. He very much looks like your average man in 1981 wearing sunglasses. He looks like he could have been anyone from anywhere doing anything. He looks like every other John, Bob, Jake, Mike, and Bill that any of us could have ever known during that time period. Police were still tracking down leads and looking into every tip and every call, and it didn't seem to matter who called in or what the tip was. Nothing was ever found to help link an actual suspect to Kelly's murder. And from here, Kelly's case just kinda went cold. The police very much believed that Kelly's murder was planned ahead of time and that it was thought out and executed exactly as the suspect had planned. And some other factors of this case made police wonder if this man was maybe local to the area. He had enough knowledge to know that the first name Bill was common for the area, but also enough knowledge to know that the last name Christensen was also common for this area. Which I feel like the name Bill will always be a common name. But with him choosing the name Bill Christensen, this would have sounded like the name of someone from the area to Kelly, her parents, and even her classmates, which is exactly what happened. They all just assumed that they knew him through somebody else. But another reason that police thought that this man was probably a local is because he had actually given Kelly the name of Jay, who was the girl on her figure skating team. Now, Jay also did babysitting gigs in her free time. So that's not something that someone who was just passing through the town of Standard would have known. Someone just passing through wouldn't have known, Jay's name in order to relay it back to Kelly. And someone passing through also wouldn't have known that both Kelly and Jay were kind of the go-to babysitters for the parents who lived in the town of Standard. So this man would have to be someone who knew enough people in the town of Standard to know this information. Or else Kelly and her parents would have been more alarmed by this random man's name and how he got Kelly's number to begin with. I feel like that would have been more alarming to them if it was just some, random name and he didn't know Jay and he didn't know that Jay was a babysitter and he didn't know that Jay was on the figure skating team with Kelly. All that stuff would have been a lot bigger red flag than what it ended up being. And once the FBI went on to talk to Jay, who was the girl on Kelly's figure skating team, Jay was the one who Bill claimed that he had gotten Kelly's number from. So Jay did tell police that she had gotten a call the same day as Kelly, and that she had also been asked to babysit by the man on the other end of the phone. So Bill had been telling the truth when he called Kelly. He actually had called Jay to see if she could babysit, and Jay told Bill that she wasn't free to babysit that evening, but she gave him Kelly's name and number, and she let him know that Kelly might be free to babysit that night for him, since Jay herself was busy. So basically, Jay got a call. She told Bill, well, I can't babysit tonight for this reason or that reason, but my friend Kelly might be able to help you out because she also babysits for other families in the area. And then that's what led Jay to give Bill Kelly's name and number. But this makes me also believe that Kelly wasn't this man's intended target, because it seems more like Jay was the one who Bill was actually after that day. And it just so happened that Jay was busy, so he just moved on to the next young babysitter in town, which sadly was Kelly. And I can only speculate, but I'm sure that Kelly's friend Jay probably has an array of different emotions surrounding this case. She was the one that gave Bill Kelly's number, and even though none of this is her fault, I would guess that she probably feels some kind of survivor's guilt, or guilt for being the one to have given Bill Kelly's information to begin with. And I feel like she probably has stayed anonymous during this whole thing, because, what if Bill wanted to come after her next, since it does seem like she was the first choice on his victim list. Now, Kelly's friend Jay was also able to tell police what little information she did gather from the call with the man claiming to be Bill Christensen. Kelly's friend Jay did remember that Bill had mentioned that he and his family were new to the area and that they were looking for a babysitter that could start as quickly as possible. Bill also told Jay that he and his wife would kind of prefer to have one consistent babysitter for their kids, and that he and his wife would usually only need a sitter for when they went out on date nights together. So none of these things set off alarm bells for Jay, which is why she didn't hesitate to give him Kelly's number. Because everything that he said sounded exactly like what a dad would say to someone if they were looking for a babysitter in 1981. This man knew Kelly's friend Jay's name, and somehow he had been able to get her number, which is another reason that it's believed that Jay was actually the intended target of his crimes. But he didn't just know Jay's name and number, he also knew that she was a figure skater and that she did babysitting to make extra money on the side. This is the part where I think that this suspect tripped himself up a little bit, maybe. He knew that Jay was a figure skater, but he also knew that Jay had been posted in the local newspaper for her talent as a figure skater. So this makes me think that the suspect saw Jay in the paper, and that's maybe where his infatuation with her started. And the day of Kelly's murder, the suspect's urges were maybe too much for him to keep control of. So when Jay told him that she wouldn't be able to babysit, he just kind of settled for Kelly instead. And this is just my theory, because this all seems like the definition of a premeditated murder. I don't think that police have ever come out and said this, but this does seem very much premeditated. A lot of work and time and thought and effort was put into concocting this name and story and fake family and kids. And I also don't think police have ever come right out and said that Jay was probably more than likely the, target victim. Again, that's just kind of my theory. Now, something else that I wasn't able to confirm, but I did see some things on Reddit and on some other online forums on this case. I normally don't go to Reddit or other online forums where people are just voicing their opinions, but this kind of stuck out to me and I saw it more than once. But it also didn't come from a credible source, so again, take this with a grain of salt. But I did read that a man had called Kelly's school shortly before her murder, and he had been asking the school for information on the girl who had just recently been featured in the local newspaper for figure skating. Also, according to these online forums, the school gave this man the girl's number, and it's believed that this girl was Jay, who Bill had called initially and gotten Kelly's number and name from. Which, if this is true, then this definitely screams premeditation. And then it just further proves that Kelly wasn't the intended victim. So I wonder if this man Bill, which we know that is an alias, that's just the name the suspect used, obviously that isn't his real name, but I wonder if Bill didn't give some kind of kernels of truth when he was on the phone with Kelly's friend Jay. Like, was he actually new to the area? Was he actually married? Did he actually have kids? I feel like it's pretty common for people like this to try to sprinkle in little bits of the truth throughout their lies to make the lies easier to keep track of. But, whether it was all a lie or whether some of it was true, Bill played the part and he did it well. One thing that still doesn't make a lot of sense to me is the motive, because it almost seems like there was no motive for this murder. Because there was no sign of sexual abuse found during Kelly's autopsy, so sex wasn't the motive. And there have been Canadian police that have come out and made public statements saying that police believe that this man either lived in the town of Standard or was familiar with the town. He knew how to get in touch with a lot of people that lived there, and he was familiar enough with the town to be seen in the local grocery store and hotel bar, which I also think he either lived there or was familiar with the town. I think that might be true. But there's really nothing else that has come out about this case, and it still remains unsolved to this day, even 43 years later. In 2019, evidence in Kelly's case was re-examined by a new lead investigator assigned to her case, and they're running that evidence through the newest technology advancements in hopes that something will turn up. There were about 40 persons of interest in Kelly's case in 2019 when her case was handed over to a new investigator, but nothing has come from that as of right now. And before I sign off, I want to go over some of the theories in this case, as I normally try to do with an unsolved case like this, because there are always theories for days. One of the first theories is that Kelly was taken and killed by someone that she knew, who was just using a fake name and babysitting story to get Kelly alone. Maybe someone from church or school, maybe a neighbor or a friend's parent, or even a distant relative like a cousin or an uncle of someone that Kelly knew. Maybe it was even someone that she just knew in passing, but she didn't know them well. But then again, I think that her parents would have recognized the car, and it's also pretty likely that in a town this small, that Kelly would have even recognized this man's voice on the phone when he called. For instance, I can call my kids at school, and when the lady at the front desk answers the phone, I can say something as vague as, "Can you let the boys know that their grandpa's going to be picking them up from school today instead of me?" The lady at the front desk doesn't have to ask my name, or what classrooms they're in, and what teachers they are, or even their grandparents' names. She literally just says, "Okay, I'll let K and P know that Papa's picking them up in your car today," and we hang up. She just knows my voice and who I am and which kids I'm calling about. And even that Papa doesn't have a car because we live in a town that tiny. So I feel like Kelly would have at least recognized this man's voice, but I could be wrong. And then I've already talked about how easily it is for someone to spot a car in a town this size. I feel like that would have been the same way in this tiny, tiny town of Standard too. So another theory is that Kelly was taken and murdered by a serial killer, because serial killers are notorious for doing extensive amounts of research on their victims and the places and towns where they plan to kill. And if this was an American serial killer, then that would make it even harder to piece together and track down. Take Israel Keys, for example. He traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to bury a kill kit, and then went back for it years later to kill the first person that he came in contact with. And this could be something where Kelly's killer was killed in a car accident, or killed in another attempt on someone's life, or at this point he could have just died from old age. Then there's the possibility that her killer was caught in the act of a different crime, and that he's still in prison, which I think either of those are possible, which may explain why this tiny town hasn't had more crimes or more murders. There's also the theory that this wasn't just one man or one person, like there was possibly one person responsible for making the calls and giving the whole "I need a babysitter" story, and then another person to actually go through and act out the actual murder. And this two-person theory could kind of explain why no one recognized the man at the hotel bar and at the grocery store. Because maybe the man who was seen in the hotel and in the bar and in the grocery store wasn't someone who was local to the Standard area, but maybe whoever they were working with did live in or near Standard. And then maybe the one that wasn't a local to the area was the one who was sent to pick Kelly up so that their face and car wouldn't be recognizable. This would also kind of explain why Kelly's body was just randomly found in a body of water that was 2.5 hours from her house. If this was a duo of two different people, then that makes a little more sense, or at least it does to me, as to why they've still never been caught. I don't know, it sounds wild, but it is at least a thought. And whether it was one person or two, it doesn't matter. I still don't think that it mattered to the suspect who he killed, because if it was that big of a deal, then the man would have just asked Jay what days she was free to babysit. But it doesn't seem like it mattered if he killed Jay or Kelly or someone else. Because if it mattered that much, then he wouldn't have just asked Jay for Kelly's information. He would have waited until a night that she would have been available. Now, there's still a $100,000 reward for anyone with information leading to the arrest and conviction of Kelly's murder, but that's really all there is on this case. And trust me, this case pisses me off every time I think about it too. You are not alone. And with that, I think it is time for me to go get my semen demons. And if you're on Patreon, I will have your episode out Friday. If you want the episode Friday and you're not a Patreon member, go sign up. It's fun over there. But with that being said, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.